Hey New City, welcome to this first week of Advent where we're talking about living hope. Today I want to draw our attention to Isaiah chapter 64, but before we hear these words, I just want to kind of set the mental picture for us. This comes out of one of the bleakest, darkest times for the people of God. The city of Jerusalem has been destroyed, the walls have been torn down, and the temple has been burned to the ground. What we should see in our mind's eye is this image of somebody sitting amidst that burned out rubble. They've got their clothes torn and grief and ashes cover their heads. And they cry out desperately to God, saying, "Oh, that you would tear open the heavens and come down, so that the mountains would quake at your presence, as when fire kindles brushwood and fire causes water to boil, to make your name known to your adversaries, so that the nations might tremble at your presence. When you did awesome deeds that we did not expect, you came down. The mountains quaked at your presence. From ages past, no one has heard, no ear has perceived, no eye has seen any God besides you, who works for those who wait for him." So I don't know what 2020 has been like for you, but I would venture to say it's probably had more than its fair share of rubble. Seems like everything's been turned upside down, and in times of suffering, it's hard to see past the darkness. John talks of the light that hasn't been overcome by the darkness, but sometimes all we see is the darkness. All we feel is a brokenness as we sit among the rubble of our lives. In those times, it can be hard to hope. And yet, Advent reminds us that we have a living hope. We have a living hope in a God who hears our prayers. And we see that, in fact, in Mark chapter 1, if you flip to the first chapter, beginning in verse 9 of Mark's Gospel. "In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan." And then here's the key, ready? "And just as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens torn apart and the Spirit descending like a dove on him." See, in Isaiah 64, we have a people desperately crying out to God to bridge that chasm between us and God, to come down into the rubble of our lives and to do something about it, to tear open the heavens and show up in a new way. And then in the person of Jesus Christ, we see God doing an awesome, new, totally unexpected thing. And we see that Jesus embodies the presence of God in a new way. See, God is the God who tears open the heavens, who comes down into the rubble of our lives. If you read on in chapter 64 of Isaiah, we see this turn it takes where the writer says that God is the potter and we are the clay. Sometimes all we have to bring to God is the rubble of our lives, but in the hands of the master potter, he can throw it back on the wheel and mold it and shape it and bring new life out of it. What's interesting is this isn't the only place in Mark's gospel where we see the tearing open of the heavens. The other one's a little bit harder for us to see right away, but if you flip to Mark 15 and the account of the crucifixion, beginning in verse 37, it says, "Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last." And then here it is. "And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom." See, this mighty curtain that they're talking about divided and separated the Holy of Holies in the temple. That place where it was believed that heaven met earth, where God's presence physically dwelt. And here we see in the death and resurrection later on of Jesus, we see God doing something new and amazing, and the presence of God breaking out in a new way. Later in Acts, we'll see that the same Spirit that descended upon Jesus descended upon the disciples in the early church. See, we don't only have a living hope in God, but we are called then to live out that hope, to embody God's presence and to take that hope into the deepest, darkest, most rubbly, broken places of the world. And there, to proclaim the good news, Emmanuel, God is with us. So during this Advent season, that's my encouragement and that's my challenge. First, look for new and unexpected ways for God to show up and to do new and amazing things, even in the midst of the rubble of our lives. And then two, be open. Be open to God using you to answer the desperate prayers of somebody else. Because the world around us is desperately praying and calling out to God, asking God to bridge that gap, to tear open the heavens and come down. So be open, live that hope so that others might know the hope of God's presence in their lives.